Okay, everyone, thank you so much for coming today, Friday at noon, to hear a little bit more about voter registration in Ohio. I have some special guests here with me today. Alexis Crosby with Campus Vote Project, and then Steve David, who works at the OSU School of Social Work, College of Social Work. They are going to take like the second half of this training. First, we're going to go through general information about how to register people in Ohio and the different ways of voting. But what I really wanted this session to focus on is how can we effectively register college students given the new Ohio voting laws? Steve, Alexis, and I were just talking a bit before we started about the campus protests that have been taking place across the nation and also specifically at OSU. So I think we have some, you know, extra things going on at the moment that really incentivizes us to get out onto different campuses and register students, talk to them about voting, and make sure we're doing that in the most effective way that we can. So I have a PowerPoint that I will go through pretty speedily here so that we have room for our special guests to talk. But like I said, we're going to talk just about briefly about the new voting laws, who can vote in Ohio, voter registration, the different options for voting, and just really briefly about what is going to be on the ballot in November. And then I will turn it over to Alexis and Steve. Okay. So as of 2023, we have new laws in Ohio regarding voting. And the laws actually covered quite a bit of things. There are different deadlines for certain voting related activities. But here I just wanted to focus on the biggest change, which is that all voters need an unexpired photo ID to vote in person. So before 2023, you could use things like utility bills, bank statements, paychecks to show you are who you say you are when you go and vote. Now we have a very specific list of accepted IDs, and that includes an Ohio driver's license, an Ohio state ID. We have various forms of military ID, and you can also use a passport. So all of these have your picture on them. And the most important thing is that it has to be unexpired. We've seen, based on data from last year's election, that quite a few people tried to vote with the appropriate ID, but that it was expired, so they weren't able to use that. And this chart just shows really quickly the 3 ways to vote in Ohio, and we'll get into that in a little bit. But for voting in person, which includes early in-person voting that you would do at your county board of elections, and for election day voting, you do need to have that photo ID. If you don't have a photo ID, you can vote via absentee mail-in ballot, and we'll talk a little bit about more about that in a bit. Who can vote in Ohio? You have to be a U.S. citizen, an Ohio resident, 18 by election day, and I think that's important given what we're going to be talking about today, which is young voters. So if you have somebody who is going to be 18 by November 5th of 2024, you can register them to vote today. There are 2 specific populations besides students that I wanted to mention briefly. One is individuals with felony conviction on their record. They can register to vote and vote as long as they're not currently serving time for that felony conviction. So if you're talking to somebody at a community event and they mention that they don't think they can vote because they have a felony conviction, they can vote. They will need to re-register if they registered to vote previous to their felony conviction, because while they were in jail or prison, they weren't able to vote, so their voter registration is void, and they have to fill out a new registration when they get out. And the reason there is a bit of confusion regarding voters with felony convictions is that different states had different rules. So in other states, individuals with a felony conviction are not able to vote, but in Ohio, they are. And then the other specific community that I wanted to mention was registering transient or homeless individuals. There is some confusion out there that you have to have a permanent living or a permanent address in order to vote or to register to vote, and that is not the case. You can register transient or homeless individuals at an address where they can easily receive and pick up mail. So oftentimes that is at a homeless shelter they may be staying at, or a local community organization where they may be getting, using for a food pantry or getting other assistance. There are a few issues to take in consideration when talking to homeless individuals about voting. The new ID requirements for election day and in-person early voting may be prohibitive for them. So they might not have that driver's license or that state ID. Absentee voting is an option for them if they don't have an ID, because they can use their date of birth and the last four digits of their social. However, they will have to go through a several step process to vote absentee, and that does require them to be able to get mail regularly from some kind of organization or wherever they choose to be registered. So they do have some additional complications. If you do volunteer with the league, we often will go to, like, for the YMC homeless shelters here in Franklin County, we will give you specific information and recommendations about what that shelter wants us, to tell individuals about voting and where they can get mail. So if you do volunteer with us for these situations, we will try and give you some specific recommendations and information. Okay, so the next three screens are snapshots of one piece of paper, and that is the voter registration form, the hard copy voter registration form. And this voter registration form can be used in all 88 counties in Ohio. So someone does not have to be, it's not just for Franklin County, it's for all of Ohio. And it's also used for people that are registering for the first time, if they're updating their address for voting purposes, or if they're changing their name for voting purposes. So it's a one-stop shop, this one-page form. And I want to go over it quickly just so that you know what voters are asked to put down here. So first, they have to check that they're a U.S. citizen and that they will be 18 years of age or older before the next general election. They will have to put their name, address. They will have to put the county where they live, and people also often misread this to say the country where they live. So we get a lot of times people will put United States. And here is where you would put the birth date and then the Ohio driver's license number or the last four digits of their social security number. The phone number is voluntary, but I do recommend that voters put this down, because if there are problems with any of the information that is put down here, the Board of Elections can reach out and contact them via phone. Okay, here the second middle portion of the form is where you would put your previous address and your if you were updating your address, and also your previous name if you were updating your name with the Board of Elections. And then finally, we have the signature box. We do encourage voters to write their signature entirely within the box, because these get scanned once we turn them into the Board of Elections, and we want to make sure that the whole signature fits in the box. Finally, I will say that we have been registering voters at high schools recently, and I've had a number of high schoolers tell me that they don't have a signature yet, which I find interesting. So what I've been telling people that say, oh, they don't know how to write in cursive or they don't have a signature, is just to write their name the way they would on an official form. So the way that they normally write their name is fine, it can be print if that's how they want their signature to look. It does not have to be cursive. Okay, so some common errors if you're registering voters. I highly encourage you to have them fill out the form and then ask them if they can stay for 30 seconds while you check it over, because there are often errors that come up. One is, like I mentioned before, people listing United States as the country when really they need to be listing the county. People sometimes will put today's date in the birth date box. And also in where they put their signature, they're supposed to put today's date and not their birth date. We do require in Ohio that voters write down a physical address and not a PO box for this form, because the Board of Elections uses this form and the address to assign the polling location. So if someone puts down a PO box, that's not giving them the information they need to let voters know where their appropriate polling location is. And then I think really the most important is that the Board of Elections staff, they're the ones that will be looking at this form and typing this into the computer. So if they can't read it, they're not going to be able to adequately process the form. So, you know, if you can't read what a voter has given to you, the best thing is just to explain to the voter that they have to write legibly and ask them if they can fill out a new form. Okay, so if you are, for example, out on a college campus and you are collecting paper registration forms from students who have completed them, you do have to return them back to the Board of Elections 10 days, 10 days or before from when the form was completed, or the voter registration deadline, which this year is October 7th of 2024. So whatever is earlier, October 7th or the 10 days. Here in Franklin County, they would be returned in person or mailed to 1700 Morse Road. It can also go to the Secretary of State's office downtown, technically. However, I would really encourage going to the Board of Elections office, because what the Secretary of State's office does is just mail it to the Board of Elections. So after you've registered a voter, let's say a student on a college campus, you can let them know that within 20 business days, they're going to receive something in the mail with information on where they can vote, the ID requirements, when the next election is. So make sure they know to be on the lookout in the mail for that information. I think that's especially important for younger voters. I know that they may not be checking their mail as regularly as older voters do, or they may have to go to another building to check their mail if we're talking about, college age voters. Okay, so what we talked about is hard copy registering. In Ohio, you can also register online at voteohio.gov. It's going to ask you the same questions that we just went over on this form, and it takes your date of birth and the last four digits of your social in order to register online. One caveat about this is that if a voter does not have a previous profile online with the state of Ohio, you'll have to register them with a hard copy form. So what that means is if you have a young voter who has never paid taxes in Ohio or doesn't have an Ohio driver's license, they don't have some kind of online presence with the state of Ohio, it's best to register them with a paper form. This can also be an issue if you have someone who just moved here from Montana. They've, been in Ohio for 2 weeks. They, probably would not have that online presence necessary to register online. Okay, so voter purges. We talk about this because this is a good way to introduce the idea of needing to check your voter registration and getting into that conversation of registering voters when you are at community events or on college campuses. So the Secretary of State in Ohio regularly goes through the voter rolls and checks to make sure that the voter rolls are up to date. And that means checking to see if people have passed away, they need to be taken off the voter rolls, if they've moved, things like that. The last voter purge happened in October 2023. About 26,000 Ohioans were purged from the voter rolls. And I just saw yesterday that Secretary of State Frank LaRose has ordered County Board of Elections to do an enhanced search through their voter rolls to take out voters who should not be on the rolls before the November elections. So we don't know exactly the date when that purge will take place, but we do know that another voter purge is coming. So if you're talking to somebody who hasn't voted in a while, they may want to just update their voter registration, fill out a new form, and that will allow them to stay on their voter rolls. So the best practice for this is to verify voters' voter registration status. And often we encourage volunteers to start off the conversation by asking voters, have you checked your voter registration recently? And most likely the answer is no. So you can go to the Secretary of State's website. It's a really easy search. You just need your first name, last name, your county. If your name comes up with the correct address, your current address, then you're all set. You're not in danger of, being purged. You have an up-to-date voter registration form. If nothing comes up, then that means you're not in the system at all. And if your name comes up, but it's at an old address that you lived at maybe 5 years ago and you've since moved, that means you need to update your voter registration. So this check of verifying your voter registration can really give a lot of good information. Okay, voting options for 2024. Our next election is going to be November 5th. You can vote in person on election day. Polling locations will be open 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 p.m. Second voting option would be to vote early in person, beginning October 8th at your local Board of Elections office. Generally, that's Monday through Friday, 8 through 5 p.m. All 88 Board of Elections offices have the same early vote hours. There may be some additional hours the last 2 weekends before Election Day, but there are no hours the day before Election Day. And finally, the third way you can vote is absentee, which is mail-in voting, which starts also October 8th. If you want to do that, you must apply for an absentee ballot by or before October 29th. And here's some additional information about absentee ballot applications. In the past, the Ohio Secretary of State's office has mailed out these absentee ballot request forms. So not the actual absentee ballots, but the form you need to use to request your absentee ballot to all registered voters before large elections like the presidential elections. We do not think these applications will be mailed out in 2024. So individuals that want to register, to vote absentee will have to take the additional step of finding and getting an absentee ballot request form, which can be found online. You can get them at libraries and other community organizations. An additional step is that absentee ballot requests cannot be submitted online. They have to be printed out, signed, and mailed or delivered in person to your county board of elections. And this is what an absentee ballot application looks like. You can request this without a photo ID. So you can request an absentee ballot to be mailed to your address or whatever address you would like it to be mailed to. Just using the last 4 digits of your social, or your Ohio driver's license or state ID number. Another point that we like to talk about when it comes to absentee ballots is that there is a system where you can track your ballot, kind of like tracking an Amazon package. So you'll have to sign up for that through the Franklin County Board of Elections website. But once you do, it's really a great system. It will either email you or text you notifications whenever your request form is received by the Board of Elections. Another notification will be sent to you when the board mails out your absentee ballot. And then a third notification goes to you when the Board of Elections has received your completed ballot and has processed it. So you can kind of keep track of it through the whole process. So just very briefly, what's going to be on the ballot in Franklin County in November? the presidential race, that's the big one, but we have a number of other smaller races, which are going to be very important here in Ohio, and that's US Senate, US House, the Ohio State House and Senate. Those are the individuals that represent us down at the State House, downtown Columbus. And then we'll also have judges at all levels, all three levels here in Ohio. So Ohio Supreme Court, the Ohio Appellate Court, and then county judges. And then we'll have a few other county offices as well. Ballot issues, we're not 100% sure yet what exactly is going to be on the ballot. That is decided usually early in August, but statewide, we might have a gerrymandering ballot issue. And Franklin County, there may be several things coming up, but one which I do know is going to be on the ballot is Link Us, which is a high-speed bus system for Franklin County. So that sounds interesting. We'll be having more information about that coming up later this summer. And then locally, you may have a school or township levels to support fire, and police services. So there's a lot of things that can be on the ballot. If you volunteer with the League of Women Voters to do some of these voter outreach events, we have a lot of materials that can help you. We have Power the Vote cards, which briefly summarize everything that I just said on this training. So that can help you out when you're registering voters. And then you can also give it to the voters so that they have information on voter ID and where to get information about candidates. We have vote411.org, which is our league site with nonpartisan candidate and an issue guide, which you can search based on your address. We also have specific information based on certain voting communities. Election protection. This is a little bit after the voter registration process, but the league does strongly support, and we also staff a lot of election protection events closer to and leading up to the election so that voters have a good experience when they go to the polls. And then finally, I want to mention vote writers. I'm not sure if Alexis and Steve will also talk about this, but if a student or younger voter or any voter does not have the appropriate voter ID that they need to vote in Ohio, Vote Writers is a nonprofit organization that can help them through that process. Okay. Ooh, I did pretty good. That was only like 20 minutes. Okay, so now we will turn it over to the main event. I'll let Alexis talk first. And Alexis is staff for Campus Voter Project, Voting Project. I'm sorry, Campus Vote Project. And she is an expert at working with college students across Ohio so that they can vote. Thanks, Alexis.
Oh, thank you, Elizabeth. I don't know if I would call myself an expert, but I know some stuff about some college campuses. And graciously, many of our students who I feel like are experts in their experience are in community with us and share with us so that we can support them. So my name is Alexis Crosby. My pronouns are she and her. My work is to help college students and administrators figure out this democracy situation going on in our state, which sometimes is empowering and sometimes is very challenging. I am working with about 40 students this year across the state who are doing different organizing tactics across their college campuses, and also work with college campuses that commit to continuously improve their outreach and democracy efforts on their campus. If they formalize that opportunity, it's called a voter-friendly campus program, and they seek a designation with us in partnership with NASPA, which is the National Association of Student Affairs Professionals. If they don't, then they just use us for advice, and that's cool too. Elizabeth asked me to kind of speak to specifically college students and college campuses. So I'm going to start out with one statement And then I probably have about 5 points that I want to hit, and we can move on. And of course, you can ask any questions that you have, please. So I will start out with saying first that due to the Higher Education Act of 1965, college campuses, particularly those college campuses that have students on campus, are required to provide access to voter registration. Now, the guidance didn't go much further than that. All they said was you're required to do this. And no best practices, no, this is how you do this, no, this is what means it's successful. So frankly, all of our institutions are figuring it out as they go along. And some are great at it, some are medium at it, some are really challenged. Um, and I would also say that college students are in a particular situation wherein they can choose to register either at home where their parents live or on the campus where they are currently engaged in their higher education opportunity. I particularly don't have an opinion on which that is. I often encourage students to register where they're engaged in community and where they find community. And for a lot of students, that is often on their college campuses because they've invested and are investing in their community in different ways. But I have no, skin in the game in regards to either or. Um, and so that's what I'm going to start with. When we think about college students, I want us to consider the landscape of our colleges. One, uh, our college students currently may be different or may feel different than when you were engaging with higher education institutions as an undergraduate, um, primarily because of COVID, but also because this is a different generation with different concerns and different um, priorities. Our graduating seniors of this year didn't get a senior year. And I want us to think about what that means. That means that the things that they cut their teeth at when you were a high school student, the running voter registration drives. I remember when I was in undergrad and when I was a high school student, a senior, I was taking on leadership opportunities in my greater community. I was taking on leadership opportunities in at my high school, actually at my college too, because I was a college credit plus student. And I was doing things like running blood drives. Those students didn't come onto campus with those opportunities necessarily, especially if they were in a state that really took COVID seriously and locked down for most of their year, right? So they were in silos at home, not engaging with anybody except for virtually. How does that impact the landscape? Well, you might end up with students who are more skittish about in-person interactions. When you're tabling, you might have students that are like, I don't want to necessarily make eye contact with you because I don't want to engage in conversation with you. Um, they're a little bit less social, and are learning their social time when they're on college campus versus coming in, having had all these opportunities to engage, having grown in that way, in that social emotional way before they get on the college campuses. And that can impact your tabling. That may mean that you have to be more outwardly friendly, but also being willing to pull back so you don't freak a student out. Even when I've been on college campuses, I've had college students that said, oh, no, 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 I don't want to do it. No, thank you. And then as I was even tabling that day, talking to other students, being friendly, being vocal, they kind of watched how the other students engaged and then circled back around and said, okay, I guess you're safe to talk to. Um, and we don't think about those things, but like these are all those interpersonal things that can impact, your engagement when you're on a college campus. Um, I want to also state that many of our young people are very leery of partisan politics. So it often advantages you to come from a nonpartisan informational lens because they might have their own opinions, but they don't know you. They don't want to talk about what those opinions are necessarily, but they may want and need the information on how to register to vote, what the deadlines are, how to get information to them, how to navigate some of these systems. They might want that information, but not want to talk to you about their opinion about a ballot initiative or their opinion about who's on the ballot. Um, and considering our political climate, that's totally understandable. Um, so, you know, considering those aspects of our landscape, as you're tabling, can be very important. It's something that our students, when they're organizing, often, even when they have their own politic, will come together and table around voter registration and say, okay, so these are all the things that are off the table. We're going to do voter registration. We're going to get our campus registered to vote and leave all the other stuff to other opportunities. Um, I also want to name that when you're on these campuses are targeted environments. And what I mean by that is, regardless of where they are, often the local population has an opinion about students being involved in politics and has expressed that in some way. Now, depending on where they are, it's been different ways. There have been all types of tactics that they've encountered, everything from students that I work with at table, having people come up to them and tell them that college students shouldn't be voting because they're not old enough to have an opinion, to mailers being sent out from interest groups telling them that it's illegal for them to vote in the state, to billboards being printed out in some communities telling them that college students will go to jail if they cast their ballot. And so when you think about landscape, those things are all in the air. So when we go into college campuses, we have to remember that while we're super excited and we're super engaged, right, in democracy, there have been a lot of forces that have told young people that this is not a space for them. And so we need to be that welcoming face and we need to be that open face. And sometimes it might take more touches on a campus um, to get that trust because they've been told in all these other ways that they don't belong and then they're unwanted. Um, the next thing I want to talk about is about voter registration. By and large, your students, even if they're Ohio students, will have to use a paper voter registration. Most of them are dependents, so they have not ever filed taxes themselves, and they will remain dependents through their undergraduate experience. Many of them don't have a registered BMV ID, even if they're from Ohio originally. So mostly those students will have to, if if you're working with a student population, they're going to be reliant on paper registration. Um, and so going in with that mindset, I would maybe have a QR code on your table if you want to have one, so they can check their voter registration or register. But most of those students are going to have to rely on a paper registration. Um, Even if they're changing their address, they're often more comfortable because that's how they originally registered to vote as well. Um, there are some challenges to even having um, a voter registration in our state without a BMV issued ID that we're seeing coming by our state house. But currently, right now, you can register without having a BMV ID with just your social, and you can vote by mail without that ID. Most students are going to be reliant on voting by mail for a variety of reasons. You got students that live in Cleveland. Originally, they're in Ohio State. You have students that are from Columbus originally. They're at the University of Toledo. So even if they want to vote in the Columbus elections, they're going to have to mail that ballot back because there's usually a real barrier for a college student to even get their ballot, 2 or 3 hours away uh, before election day. And we're working on guidance for this, but um this whole paper mailing things back and forth type of situation, students are not used to it. Not at all. And the reason why I say that is because they grew up in the digital age. They're the first generation that was truly connected virtually for most of their lives, right? From the time they were little kids. And so the idea of doing mail in anything is super foreign. The idea of having to fill things out on paper, they don't even have to accept their college entrance on paper anymore, right? They don't have to turn in, they have to turn in very little to their institution on paper at all. Um, and I know even when I was at my institution, when I was younger, we had maybe I had to get my birth certificate to them, but otherwise, most things you could fill out virtually. Even promissory notes were virtual as well. So they're coming from an all digital environment and then being asked to interact with systems that they've never had to use. So very practical questions that students encounter when they're doing tabling or when I've tabled with them is, where do I put the address? And very real question, how do I address this envelope? Oh, I need a return address. Where do I put that? Where do I get a stamp? And most of our technically, you're not supposed to give student stamps for voting activities because it is a violation of the paying for voting rule, even though a stamp is under $1. And I have all these opinions about that. But strategies that folks use are helping people figure out where they can access stamps. So, for example, um, these are the nearest 5 places that have stamps. You know, because again, they probably have never had to keep a stamp, have a stamp, and interact with a stamp uh, at all because they haven't had to interact with our mail systems. In addition to them having to engage to get their ballots back with the USPS, with the U.S. Postal Service, and their internal campus mail largely, right? Because most students live on campus in on-campus environments. And so their mail system is on the timeline and the US Postal Service is on the timeline. And that might require you to suggest that they turn in their ballot or their request for ballot sooner than listed deadlines to make sure that they make those deadlines, they're able to get their ballot back in time, they're able to track their ballot, etc. And um, those are all things that are going to be very new to students. Um, the fourth thing that I want to say is culturally, our young people are extremely passionate. They don't often connect that passion to being engaged in democracy. What do I mean by that? I've met young people who volunteer 3 or 4 times a week at a homeless shelter or at a church or tutoring young people or coordinating large programs on their campus to serve community. And they're super, super duper passionate about that. They are 100% showing up. They often are not fully aware of how our systems of civic engagement and democracy could help solve some of the issues that they're seeing every day. And um, on top of what I said before, have been told that that's not really the space for them. So they're working within the space where they've been welcomed, right? Because everyone wants, everyone's super excited to see a college student that wants to volunteer, trains them, shows up all the time, but they're getting the opposite messaging about being involved in democracy. And it's very obscured, even for the lay voter outside of a college environment to understand, you know, I might need to pay attention to who's on my school board to understand um, where dollars are, sent for education and I'm volunteering in this school, multiple times a week. Um, and if we're in community, we can help make those connections because we are the high propensity voters. we're the people that are, paying attention to what's happening at our state house. We're the people that are really concerned about what's happening in our legislator. And so we can help them make those connections. But often they're, those two things are at play. They don't see that connection. And also they've been told that that's not a place for them, even if they do see it, when that's absolutely not the case. And the fifth thing I could say is once you connect young people, once you are able to turn them on to being engaged in democracy, they are probably the greatest proponents for our democracy. Um, and I think that, that's often left out of the conversation because we talk about how tough it is to get college students engaged and things like that. But in my experience, once you are able to connect them to systems, once you're able to support them getting engaged in democracy, they are extremely engaged, extremely excited, want to get their communities involved, want to make sure other young people have access to their ballot, and truly love and care and want our democracy to be successful. Um, and so when we look at this, that's one of those things that keeps me going because once young people are engaged, they're so thoughtful and so passionate and often look at things in a way that I don't see, not in that environment myself anymore. Um, and I think that's it. And of course, any questions people have about specific things, I'm happy to answer.
Thanks, Alexis. That was really great. I appreciated that. Your point of view, and especially thinking about like how college students are thinking these days, because you're right, it's very different than when I was in college. I want to give Steve a chance to talk a bit because he does a lot of democracy work specifically at OSU. So Steve, if you had any like specific, because we although we have multiple campuses in Franklin County, I think OSU is like the toughest nut to crack a little bit when it comes to voter registration and students. So if you had any thoughts about that.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much, Elizabeth. So I kind of just wanted to like give a +1 to 3 things that I heard like Elizabeth and Alexis say like as they've been talking. So I feel like the one is like this question about like the method, right? And one of the most like frequent aha moment, or not aha moments, but like when you see the wheels start turning for a student is when like, okay, oh yeah, like I'm registered, like and you even you check them and they're good, like okay, yeah, that's like I'm set. But then when you ask them like, okay, well, how are you going to cast your ballot? And that's often where you see the person being like, oh, because it's like, here's a random Tuesday in November that you have class or you're working. And so like doing a bit of that prompting, I think is like really important. So like making like taking that conversation to the next stage, like, okay, well, but like, what's your plan? That can really get people thinking about like some of these other, like the nuts and bolts of the method. And whereas Alexis, like, like took kind of an agnostic stance on like at home or like on campus, like with some of the challenges we've seen with students actually completing their vote by mail ballots in Ohio, I would definitely like I'm a proponent of like it's easier to be able to walk to the Ohio Union or to one of your off-campus locations and just like update your registration here. You can tell people like you can update your registration as many times as you want based on where you are. But if any of these things around like an absentee ballot feels prohibitive for you, you are able to update for your campus address. So making sure that folks are aware that that is an option for them. And so that way is easier to like potentially use the early vote system or use like in person on election day, noting the ID barriers, like particularly for out-of-state students who may be there. So there's the method piece. The other thing is just like about like the one of the things that Elizabeth shared that I think is most powerful when I'm talking to folks is Vote 411. Like folks are so hungry for nonpartisan research tools to be able to know what's on the ballot. Folks like want that content. Like I like when I send people there and they're like, oh, like so many like, oh my gosh, like this is what I needed, what I like wanted to see, like just don't know how to get like unbiased information on it. So like any type of like ballot research tools like go a real long way with folks. And just the number of times I've had people say like, it was so nice to have like a safe space for me to like talk about like what's on the ballot and just like educate people on, like, and that on what like offices they're going to be voting for, like what like different issues are, particularly like I'm thinking about in 2023 where we had this like, vote yes or vote no in August, and then vote yes or vote no in November, that then switched based on like what your orientation were to those issues. Like be able to provide that space for folks and direct them to some nonpartisan resources goes a really long way. So again, like, okay, yeah, I'm registered. Be like, okay, like, what's your tool for looking up what's on your ballot is something I say a lot. And then like, it's a question to which like you often get a blank, like, I don't really know. And so like give folks some of those resources. And then the final thing that I want to offer is kind of in alignment with this, what Alexis was saying around folks not seeing the link between their passions and like the formalized political system. You got to hear people. Like there's a lot of folks who are seeing an election where like the top of ticket does not resonate with their values right now. And so, I work in the College of Social Work. I'm a social worker by training. We like say this thing a lot about like meeting people where they are and just the importance of like of listening. And so like you got to listen to folks. And like if you meet like hesitation or resistance or frustration with like moralizing about civic duty, like you're going to lose folks like right off the jump. So like make sure like creating that space to be like, I'm there as well, where like I'm not seeing things that like resonate with all my values can be a really powerful intervention to then open up space for conversation on other things. So like create that space, like non-judgmental listening can go a long way here. And really like having a why of your own so that you can talk about why this is important to you, that can then like get people to connect with their why as well. So yeah, that's what I had as far as like my experience like here on OSU. Oh, the one other thing I wanted to I did want to drop in here is just like the university's space policy. So basically like the university whereas it is a public university, it does basically function as like private property. Like the property of the university is dedicated to the functioning, like to the teaching and research functions of the university. And so particularly, like classroom spaces and the buildings are like closed to the public, so those are reserved for students and folks who are working at the university. But like your open space and your green spaces, your oval, are generally regarded as like public forums. Like folks are, come and go all the time. Like you see people collecting signatures there from lots of different groups. Like basically make sure you're not, you're not causing a disruption to the university mission. And so we've seen recently like how the university has been invoking this space policy a lot for student protests. But just know that like if you are showing up with a clipboard, engaging students, they're not going to give you a hard time. But like as far as like setting up signage or like public displays is something that like if you want to do that kind of work, I would, this link here, you can like get the link to actually request space from the university registrar. But generally these kind of like civic engagement functions, they're gonna let you like do your stuff if you're like out there talking to students. But just know like that is the university space policy. Don't have amplified sound if you like don't want a bullhorn particularly like in this environment is going to like draw undue attention to you. But yeah, just want to like say a thank you to Elizabeth and Alexis and all of you who are interested in doing this work. And please feel free to treat me as a resource. I work on campus, so I don't have access to all the answers you may have, but I'm more than happy to kind of be a liaison for folks who may be looking for some additional guidance.
Thanks, Steve. Does anyone, we have a few minutes left, if anyone has specific questions about voter registration, talking with college students. Well, I did have a question and I don't know the answer to this. So, Alexis or Steve, if you have heard anything, I'd be interested in your thoughts. Have you seen or noticed or heard any data about if the new Ohio voter registration, or I'm sorry, the new Ohio voting laws, especially as it comes with the voter ID requirement, has that impacted college voting? And it could be anecdotal, or if you have any data. I don't know if there is
Um,
any data, but
we don't have concrete numbers for a variety of reasons. But anecdotally, the students that and the staff that I work with on campus have seen more students opting to vote, especially the out-of-state students, where their families are from, because Ohio's law is some of the strictest in our country. And so they're like, well, looking at, apples to apples comparison, it's easier for me to vote in this state versus this state. And so that's what I'm going to do. Um, some students feel the opposite, and it definitely depends on the community, and they feel like this is a direct attack on their civil liberties, and therefore they are ready to jump through all the hoops to make access to the ballot in Ohio possible. Essentially, they don't want the this law to win, very stubborn, you know. And so I've seen both depending on the community. Um, but that's a good question. Don't have great numbers in terms of that yet, but looking forward to having it.
And I guess the other, for anyone who's here who may not have seen this, like, I'm just putting the link here to the All Voting is Local report, that they did on provisional ballot rejection rates because of ID issues. So Elizabeth doesn't get to your question specifically, but just for any of our attendees who haven't read this, basically, like, after HB 458, we saw this huge jump in the number of provisional ballots being rejected for not having proper identification. So the All Voting is Local folks like demonstrated like what is happening at the state of Ohio, in the state of Ohio at large.
And also in general in 2023, we had a 10-point jump in 18 to 24 voters uh in the state. And that's based on data that we received from our state table. I was at Summit last week where that was the number that they pulled from November 2023.
that's interesting. You think it had to do with the two statewide issues on the ballot, maybe, or
I
I mean,
would
who
almost
can say, but
entirely attribute. And part of it is that those are things that like young people were concerned about. Um, and frankly, we're very educated about because of the coordinated efforts across the state to just educate folks, and re-educate folks because issue one was on the summer ballot was totally different from issue two. So the coordinated efforts of everybody across the state to say, wait, and turn around in like in this 6 weeks, I think, uh, and re-educate people on what that meant. So I think that that was part of it as well, as that it was highly visible, and getting information on what those two ballot measures were was really easy at that time because of all the coordinated efforts. So I think that also had a lot to do with it as well.
any other questions?
So, hi, Alexis. My name's Barbara. I'm curious about, I'm looking at the website on my phone for Campus Vote Project.
Mhm.
That data that you just mentioned, is that on your website or
32
where's,
32% participation.
yeah, is that on your website or is it
That's not our data that we published, just data that came from our state table.
your
So I
state
imagine that it
table?
will be published soon, but it was fresh data as of last week.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
And not on our website, but most likely on probably on Ohio Voices website.
So I will be sending out a follow-up email that will have links to everything that was posted in the chat, the links that were in the chat, and then our slides and the recording. I really appreciate you all taking the time to come and talk about registering college voters. And I definitely want to say thank you to Alexis and Steve for coming out and really adding a great perspective to our usual voter registration training. Appreciate that very much. Everyone have a wonderful weekend. And if you have any follow-up questions, feel free to reach out. I'm going to include Steve and Alexa's email in my follow-up as well, if that's okay. If you have any future questions, we would be happy to assist you if we can. And if we can't, we can point you in the right direction. Okay, everyone have a great weekend.
So much, Elizabeth.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Bye, Steve. Thanks, Alexis.